Elijah, clean that up faster, or maybe this floor is the only place you belong. The laughter didn't explode, it spread, low and controlled, like a ripple across polished glass, a few executives exchanging amused glances, a couple of smirks hiding behind coffee cups, the kind of laughter that didn't need volume to carry weight, it carried power. Elijah Carter didn't look up right away. The mop glided across the marble floor in slow, deliberate strokes, the faint scent of industrial cleaner cutting through the expensive cologne lingering in the air. Above him, a chandelier cast fractured light across the conference room table, reflecting in the surface he had just polished, turning the entire room into a mirror that showed everything: tailored suits, gold cufflinks, confident postures, and him, a quiet figure in a faded uniform, standing where no one important ever stood for long. 12 people sat around the table, all of them watching now, some openly, some pretending not to, their attention shifting from quarterly projections and acquisition slides to the man with the mop who had just been reminded of his place. Richard Hale, at the head of the table, didn't smile. He didn't need to. His silence held more authority than the laughter. His fingers tapped once against the edge of a leather folder, a subtle signal that the moment had already served its purpose. Elijah reached the edge of the spill and paused, just for a second, his reflection staring back at him from the gleaming floor, steady eyes, calm breath, no trace of the heat that had just been thrown his way. The room waited, though no one would admit it. Something about the way he stood there, unmoving, unhurried, didn't match the role they had already assigned him. A chair shifted. Someone cleared their throat. The projector hummed softly, frozen mid-slide, numbers suspended in silence. Elijah straightened slowly, not fully, just enough to ease the tension in his back, and for the briefest moment, his gaze lifted, not defiant, not submissive, just precise, landing somewhere near the center of the table where a set of financial charts lay slightly misaligned. He noticed things like that. He always had. A decimal point off by one place. A clause buried in dense language. A projection that leaned too heavily on optimism. He noticed patterns the way other people notice noise. But he said nothing. Not yet. The air conditioning vent above whispered a steady current, brushing against the back of his neck, grounding him in the present, in the weight of the room, in the distance between who they thought he was and who he had always been. Richard leaned back slightly, eyes flicking toward the glass wall that overlooked the city, 40 stories below, traffic moving like distant veins of light. "Let's stay focused," he said, voice smooth, controlled, already moving past Elijah as if the interruption had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. But the room didn't fully return. Not immediately. Because something had shifted, not in volume, not in posture, but in the silence itself. Elijah lowered his gaze again, guiding the mop in one final pass, the marble now flawless, reflecting the ceiling, the table, the faces, and the empty chair at the head of the room that no one questioned, not yet. He turned slightly, bucket wheels creaking softly against the floor, and began to move toward the exit, his steps measured, quiet, almost invisible. Almost. Because just before he reached the door, he paused again, hand resting lightly on the handle, as if listening, not to the voices, but to the space between them, where decisions were really made. Inside that silence, something waited. And this time, he wasn't going to ignore it. The service hallway swallowed the noise the moment the door closed behind him, cutting off the low hum of voices and the sharp edge of polished conversation, leaving only the distant echo of footsteps and the steady buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. Elijah Carter did not rush. He never rushed. The bucket wheels rolled beside him with a soft, rhythmic creak, water shifting gently inside as he guided it down the narrow corridor that smelled faintly of detergent and warm metal. This was his world now, a place no one important ever looked twice at, a place where conversations faded before they reached the walls and decisions were already made long before. Anyone like him was allowed to exist in the room. He stopped at a small utility closet halfway down the hall, pushing the door open with his shoulder and stepping inside. The space was barely 6 feet wide, shelves lined with cleaning supplies, a single folding chair tucked into the corner beneath a flickering light that hummed like it had something to say but never did. Elijah set the mop aside, hands moving with quiet familiarity, and reached into his bag, pulling out a worn notebook, its edges softened from years of use. The cover was plain, almost forgettable, but inside, every page was filled with neat, deliberate handwriting, numbers, strategies, observations, things no one ever asked him about and no one ever expected him to understand. He flipped to the latest page, the ink still fresh from the night before, columns of projections drawn from memory, reconstructed from glimpses of reports left unattended, from presentations he was never meant to hear but always did. He had learned long ago that invisibility was not just a condition, it was access. People spoke freely when they believed no one was listening. They revealed everything when they assumed no one could understand. Elijah sat down slowly, the chair creaking under his weight, and traced a line across the page with his finger, stopping at a number that did not sit right. It had not felt right in the room either, buried beneath confident voices and expensive certainty, but here, in the quiet, it stood out like a fracture beneath glass. A revenue forecast inflated by just enough to pass unnoticed, a liability shifted in a way that looked clean on paper but carried weight over time, the kind of detail that did not fail immediately, but when it did not ask permission. He exhaled slowly, steady, controlled, the way he had taught himself years ago when everything else felt uncertain. There was a time when numbers like these were not something he had to reconstruct in silence. There was a time when he had sat at tables like the one upstairs, not holding a mop but leading conversations, shaping decisions, building something that had once felt like it could not be taken away. But that was before. Silence became safer than being heard, before stepping forward meant losing more than just a seat. The light above flickered once, then steadied, casting a pale glow across the notebook, across his hands, across the quiet determination that never quite left him. Elijah closed the notebook carefully, pressing the cover flat as if sealing something inside it, and rested his hands on his knees for a moment, listening again, not to the building, not to the voices upstairs, but to the space within himself where hesitation used to live. It was quieter now. Not gone, but quieter. He stood, slow and deliberate, placing the notebook back into his bag, and reached for the mop again, fingers wrapping around the handle with practiced ease. The hallway outside waited, just as it always did, indifferent, unchanged. But something inside him had shifted, not loud enough for anyone else to notice, not yet, just a small alignment, like a number finally falling into place. And as he stepped back into the corridor, guiding the bucket forward, his pace remained the same, his posture unchanged, but the silence he carried with him felt different, heavier with intention, as if it already knew that staying invisible was no longer going to be enough. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime that barely echoed in the wide executive corridor, but the shift in atmosphere was immediate, like stepping into a different temperature without warning, colder not in degrees but in presence. Richard Hale walked out first, his pace measured, each step precise against the polished stone floor, the faint click of his shoes carrying just enough weight to signal authority without needing to announce it. Behind him, two senior executives followed closely, tablets in hand, voices lowered but urgent, numbers still moving between them as if the meeting had not truly ended, only relocated. Richard did not respond right away. He listened without looking, eyes fixed ahead on the long stretch of glass that framed the skyline, sunlight pouring in through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting sharp lines across his tailored suit. He paused near the edge, hand settling briefly at his sides before one lifted. Slightly, a small motion that silenced the voices behind him without a word. The city below moved in constant motion, cars threading through intersections, people reduced to distant figures, everything operating on a scale he understood completely. Control was not something Richard chased. It was something he maintained. Every deal, every acquisition, every calculated risk had built toward this position, and he held it with a certainty that left no room for doubt, especially not from someone outside the structure he had spent years perfecting. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as a fragment of the earlier moment surfaced, not the laughter, not the interruption, but the stillness that followed it, the way the room had paused longer than it should have. He dismissed it quickly, a minor disruption, nothing more, and turned back toward the hallway. The numbers for the Hale-Tech merger, he said, voice even, controlled, I want them reviewed again before close of business. One of the executives nodded immediately, already scrolling through files, but there was hesitation, just a fraction, the kind that barely registered unless someone was looking for it. Richard noticed. He always did. "Is there something unclear?" he asked, not raising his voice, but sharpening it just enough to draw a line. "No, sir," the executive replied quickly, adjusting his grip on the tablet. "It is just that the projections are already finalized. The board signed off this morning." Richard held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then shifted his attention away, as if the answer had already lost value the second it was spoken. "Finalized does not mean flawless," he said, turning toward his office at the end of the corridor, the double doors standing open as if waiting for him. Inside, the space was expansive, minimal, every detail placed with intention, from the dark wood desk to the single-framed photograph positioned at the far corner, a quiet reminder of something personal he rarely acknowledged during business hours. He stepped inside without slowing, the others following only as far as the threshold before stopping, understanding the boundary without needing it explained. Richard moved behind the desk, fingers brushing lightly across the surface as he looked down at the documents already arranged there, pages aligned, numbers clean, everything appearing exactly as it should. But something about it felt incomplete, not visibly, not structurally, just beneath the surface, like a note in a song that did not quite resolve. He picked up the top page, scanning quickly, eyes moving with practiced efficiency, and paused at a line he had already read twice before, a projection that leaned forward just slightly more than it should have, supported by assumptions that held together on paper but lacked the weight he expected. His grip on the page tightened just enough to crease the corner, a rare break in his otherwise controlled posture. Outside, through the glass wall, he caught a faint reflection of movement in the hallway, a figure passing by, pushing a cleaning cart, steady, unremarkable, almost invisible. For a moment, his focus lingered there longer than logic required, not because of who it was, but because of the disruption it represented, a variable that did not belong in the equation he had already solved. He looked back down at the page, the numbers unchanged, the structure intact, and yet the certainty he relied on felt just slightly out of alignment, like something had been seen but not fully understood. He set the paper down slowly, the room falling into a deeper silence, one that no longer felt entirely controlled, and for the first time that day, Richard did not immediately move forward, as if the next decision required something more than authority to make. The late afternoon light stretched longer across the hallway, turning the glass walls into pale gold mirrors as Elijah moved steadily from one section to the next, the quiet rhythm of his work blending into the background of a building that never truly stopped thinking. His cart paused just outside a smaller conference room, its door slightly open, voices drifting out in low, focused tones, different from the earlier laughter, tighter, edged with something closer to concern. Elijah did not intend to listen, but he did not need to try. Words carried easily when people believed they were alone in their importance. "If those numbers hold, we are exposed within 6 months, one voice said, sharp, controlled but no longer confident. Another responded quickly, "They will hold." The model was reviewed 3 times. A pause followed, longer than comfortable, and then quieter. "That is not what I asked." Elijah's hand rested lightly on the cart handle, his posture unchanged, eyes lowered, the picture of someone passing through without presence, yet every word settled with clarity, each sentence fitting into the framework already forming in his mind. 6 months was not the problem. It was the illusion of stability that came before it, the way projections masked fragility until it became too late to correct without consequence. He had seen it before, not once, but enough times to recognize the pattern without needing the full report. He stepped forward, guiding the cart past the doorway, but the conversation followed him, fragments of uncertainty trailing behind as if trying to catch up with something already moving ahead. By the time he reached the end of the corridor, the building had shifted again, quieter now, the kind of quiet that came when confidence began to thin. He stopped near a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city, setting the mop aside for just a moment, his gaze lifting slightly, not toward the skyline, but toward the reflection in the glass. For a second, the layers overlapped, the city behind him, the hallway around him, and his own image standing between them, not fully belonging to either. He reached into his bag, pulling out the notebook once more, flipping it open with practiced ease, pages turning until he found the line he had marked earlier. The numbers did not change, but the context had. What had been a quiet concern was now a confirmed fracture, one that extended further than anyone upstairs seemed ready to admit. His fingers moved quickly, adding a few more notes, adjusting a figure, tracing a connection that had not been obvious until now. It was not complicated. That was the problem. The error was simple enough to overlook, buried beneath complexity that distracted from its impact, a small shift in liability that, over time, would not remain small. Elijah closed the notebook slowly, the decision settling in the same place where hesitation used to be. He did not look toward the executive floor, did not consider who would listen or who would dismiss him. That question had already been answered earlier in the day. Instead, he focused on the door at the end of the hall, the one that led back toward the offices where decisions were made, where certainty still held, at least on the surface. His grip tightened slightly on the handle of the cart, not out of tension, but resolve, the kind that did not announce itself, did not demand attention, but did not retreat either. He began to move, step steady, unhurried, the wheels rolling forward with the same quiet sound as before, yet carrying something different now, something that did not belong to the role he had been given. As he approached the executive corridor again, the light shifted across the floor, reflecting upward, catching the edges of glass and steel, illuminating a path that had always been there, just rarely taken from this direction. He stopped just outside the open doors, the same room, the same table, the same people who had already decided what he was worth, and for a moment, the silence returned, not around him, but within him, clear, focused, and finally aligned. Then, without raising his voice, without changing his posture, Elijah stepped forward, crossing the threshold not as someone passing through, but as someone choosing to be seen. The room did not welcome him the second time. It tightened instead, like a space that had already decided what belonged inside it and what did not. Conversation slowed, then stopped, one by one, as Elijah stepped past the threshold, the quiet roll of his cart marking his presence before his voice ever could. A few heads turned immediately, others followed a second later, drawn not by importance, but by disruption. He moved only a few feet in before stopping, the polished table stretching between him and the people who had already dismissed him once. Richard Hale did not sit this time. He remained standing near the head of the table, one hand resting lightly against the back of his chair, posture controlled, expression unreadable, but his eyes sharper now, fixed directly on Elijah as if measuring something that did not fit. "This floor is already clean," one of the executives said, tone clipped, impatient, trying to restore order by reducing the moment to something simple. Elijah did not respond to that. He set the mop aside, slowly, deliberately, the sound of the handle touching the floor soft but precise, and for the first time, he lifted his gaze fully, not scanning the room, not searching for approval, but landing directly where the decision Saturday, the projection for the Hale-Tech merger, he said, voice calm, even, carrying without force, "It is overestimating stability by about 4.2%. The silence that followed was immediate and complete, heavier than before, not because of what he said, but because of who said it. A brief pause, then a short exhale from someone near the far end of the table, almost a laugh, but not quite confident enough to become one. "Excuse me," another executive replied, leaning back slightly, eyes narrowing as if trying to process whether this was real or some kind of misplaced interruption. Elijah did not move. The liability shift in the third quarter is being absorbed on paper, but not in practice, he continued, tone unchanged, as if he were describing something obvious, something already known. If the acquisition closes under the current structure, the exposure compounds within 6 months. It does not fail immediately. That is why it looks stable. A chair shifted. Someone reached for a tablet, fingers moving quickly across the screen, pulling up the same numbers they had reviewed hours earlier, now seen from a different angle they had not considered. "That is not possible," the first executive said, faster this time, more defensive, the edge in his voice returning as a shield. "These projections were verified." Elijah nodded once, small, almost imperceptible. "Yes," he said, "they were verified against the wrong assumption." The words did not rise. They settled. That was what made them harder to ignore. Richard had not spoken yet. His gaze had not left Elijah since the first sentence, and now, something in his posture shifted, not outwardly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but internally, like a line being redrawn. And what assumption would that be? Richard asked finally, his voice quieter than before, not dismissive, not accepting, just precise. Elijah held his gaze without hesitation. That risk can be redistributed without consequence, he said. It cannot. It only moves. And right now, it moves here. He did not point. He did not need to. The implication landed exactly where it needed to, across the table, into the structure they had built, into the certainty they had relied on. Another silence followed, longer this time, stretching across the room, pressing against the glass walls, settling into the space between authority and truth. Then, almost on cue, a different kind of reaction began to form, not laughter this time, but resistance, the kind that rose when control felt challenged. "This is inappropriate," one voice said, sharper now, standing halfway from their seat. "You are out of line. You do not have the credentials, the access, or the authority to." "He has the numbers," another voice cut in quietly, eyes still fixed on the screen, fingers frozen mid-scroll. That shifted everything. Not completely, not yet, but enough to fracture the certainty that had filled the room just minutes ago. Richard's hand tightened slightly on the back of the chair, his gaze flicking once to the data, then back to Elijah, the space between them no longer defined by position, but by something far less stable. "Security," someone called from near the door, the word hanging in the air like a last attempt to restore order. But Richard did not repeat it. He did not move. And in that hesitation, small but undeniable, the room changed again, not loudly, not visibly, but in the one place that mattered most, where control began to slip, not because it was taken, but because it had just been questioned in a way no one in that room was prepared for. No one moved at first, not even the man who had called for security, his voice now lingering in the air without direction, like a command that had lost its authority the moment it was spoken. The room held still, suspended between reaction and realization, the kind of silence that pressed against the edges of every thought, forcing each person to confront what had just been said without the comfort of dismissal. Elijah stood exactly where he was, neither advancing nor retreating, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, as if the tension in the room did not belong to him at all. The light from the windows stretched across the floor, catching the edge of his shoes, reflecting upward in soft lines that broke against the table, the chairs, the faces now turned inward, away from him and toward the data that had suddenly become uncertain. One executive leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes fixed on the screen, scrolling slowly, then faster, searching not for confirmation, but for contradiction. Another adjusted their glasses, blinking twice as if the numbers might shift back into place if given enough time. But they did not. They stayed exactly where Elijah had placed them, quiet and undeniable. Richard Hale remained standing, his hand still resting on the back of the chair, but his grip had loosened, fingers no longer pressing into the leather with the same certainty as before. His gaze moved once more between the table and Elijah, not dismissing, not accepting, but recalibrating, as if the framework he had relied on was being measured again in real time. The hum of the projector filled the space, steady and indifferent, casting the same slide across the wall, the same clean lines, the same confident projections that now felt incomplete, like a sentence missing its final word. No one spoke. Not because they had nothing to say, but because anything said too quickly would reveal more than it protected. Elijah inhaled slowly, the breath controlled, almost silent, and for a brief moment, his eyes lowered, not in submission, but in thought, as if giving the room time to arrive at the same conclusion he had already reached. He did not push further. He did not repeat himself. He simply stood within the truth he had placed there, allowing it to settle, to expand, to become visible in its own time. Outside the glass walls, the city continued. Without pause, cars moving in steady lines, sunlight fading slightly as the afternoon stretched toward evening, a reminder that time did not slow for hesitation, that decisions delayed did not remain neutral. Inside, however, time felt different, heavier, each second carrying weight as the gap between perception and reality narrowed. One of the executives finally exhaled, long and quiet, leaning back in their chair as if something had just been confirmed without needing to be said aloud. Another set their tablet down carefully, the small sound of it touching the table echoing more than it should have. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus, the kind that came when control was no longer assumed, but required effort to maintain. He stepped forward once, slowly, moving around the chair instead of sitting, closing a small distance that had separated him from the table, from the data, from the moment itself. His voice, when it came, was lower than before, stripped of its earlier certainty, but not its authority. "Run it again," he said, not to Elijah, not to anyone in particular, but to the room as a whole. No one questioned the instruction. Fingers moved immediately, screens shifting, models recalculating, assumptions being tested not for validation, but for failure. The air changed with it, no longer resistant, no longer dismissive, but searching. Elijah remained where he was, silent now, his role in the moment complete, his presence no longer an interruption, but something the room could not ignore, even if it had not yet decided how to define it. The light continued to shift across the floor, softer now, longer shadows forming along the edges of the room, wrapping around the table, around the people who had once filled it with certainty, and now sat within something quieter, something more fragile. And in that quiet, something else began to take shape, not loud, not immediate, but undeniable, like the first crack in a surface that had always looked unbreakable. The numbers did not argue back, they simply rearranged themselves under scrutiny, line by line, assumption by assumption, until what once appeared balanced began to lean, then tilt. Then exposed the quiet instability that had been hiding beneath confidence. Screens flickered as models recalculated, projections shifting in real time, percentages adjusting by fractions that seemed small until they were not, until they connected, until they formed a pattern no one in the room could dismiss anymore. One executive leaned closer to the display, lips parting slightly as if about to speak, then stopping, because the answer had already appeared before the question could be formed. Another sat back slowly, shoulders lowering, the posture of certainty dissolving into something quieter, something closer to realization. "It compounds," someone said under their breath, not as a statement to the room, but as a recognition to themselves. "It compounds faster than we projected." No one responded to that directly, because they did not need to. The data spoke now, not in bold claims, but in quiet corrections, revealing the cost of a single misplaced assumption that had been repeated enough times to look like truth. Richard Hale stood at the edge of the table, his gaze fixed on the shifting numbers, but his focus was no longer on the surface. He was tracing the structure beneath it, the decision points, the approvals, the chain of certainty that had led to this moment. His jaw tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in recalibration, the kind that came when control was not lost, but challenged in a way that required something deeper than authority to regain. He lifted his eyes slowly, not to the executives, not to the screens, but to Elijah, who still stood where he had been, unchanged, silent, as if he had never needed the room to catch up in the first place. "Where did you learn to see that?" Richard asked, his voice low, not confrontational, but direct, cutting through the tension without raising it. The question did not carry accusation. It carried weight. Elijah did not answer immediately. He held the silence for a moment, not to create drama, but because the answer did not belong to the room the way the numbers did. When he finally spoke, his tone remained even, grounded, as if he were stating something simple. "In rooms like this," he said. A faint shift moved through the space, subtle but unmistakable, as if the air itself had recognized something before the people did. One of the executives frowned slightly, trying to place the meaning behind the words, while another glanced toward Richard, searching for a response that would restore the hierarchy they understood. But Richard did not provide one. Instead, he studied Elijah more closely now, not as an interruption, not as an anomaly, but as a variable that had been overlooked, one that did not fit into the structure he had built, yet somehow understood it from the inside. "That level of analysis does not come from observation alone," Richard said, quieter now, more precise, each word measured. "It comes from experience." Elijah's gaze did not waver. "Yes," he replied simply. The simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation could have. Another silence followed, but this one was different, not tense, not resistant, but shifting, the kind that opened space rather than closing it. The executives around the table were no longer looking at Elijah as a disruption. They were looking at him as something they could not yet define, something that had just proven itself in the only language that mattered in that room. Richard stepped back slightly, his hand releasing the chair completely now, the gesture small, but significant, as if letting go of a position he had not realized he was holding so tightly. His eyes moved once more to the data, now fully recalculated, the outcome no longer uncertain, the flaw no longer hidden. Then back to Elijah. The connection between those 2 points had been made, and it could not be undone. Run the alternative scenario, Richard said finally, voice steady again, but different, not built on assumption, but on correction. Use his adjustment. The word landed quietly, but it changed everything. He's not the model. Not the team. He's. No one questioned it. No one laughed. Fingers moved again across screens, but this time, the direction had shifted, guided by something that had not been invited into the room, but had just redefined it. Elijah remained still, not stepping forward, not stepping back, as the room reorganized itself around a truth it had not expected to hear, the silence now carrying something new, not resistance, not doubt, but recognition beginning to take shape, slow, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. The recalculated model settled into place with a quiet finality that no one in the room could argue with, the adjusted projections no longer leaning on fragile assumptions but grounded in a structure that held under pressure, each variable accounted for, each risk placed exactly where it belonged instead of hidden behind optimism. One by one, the executives stopped moving, their hands resting on the table, their screens no longer shifting, because there was nothing left to adjust that would change the outcome. The alternative scenario held. Not just theoretically, but practically, cleanly, in a way that made the original model feel incomplete by comparison. A low exhale moved through the room, not relief, not yet, but recognition, the kind that came when something undeniable had just been placed in front of them and could not be ignored without consequence. Richard Hale remained standing, but his posture had changed, not weakened, not uncertain, but realigned, as if the ground beneath the decision had shifted and he had adjusted without stepping away. His gaze rested on the final numbers for a moment longer, then lifted again toward Elijah, not with the same distance as before, not with the same hierarchy that had defined every earlier interaction, but with something quieter, something closer to acknowledgment. The room waited, not for authority, but for clarity, for a signal of what came next. Richard stepped forward slowly, moving around the table until he stood on the same side as the others, closer now, the physical distance between him and Elijah reduced in a way that no one commented on, but everyone noticed. He stopped just a few feet away, the silence deepening again, but this time it did not press, it opened. What you pointed out, Richard said, his voice measured, steady, but stripped of the earlier edge, it changes the entire risk profile of this deal. He paused briefly, not for effect, but because the weight of the statement required space. If we had moved forward without it, he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The outcome was already visible on every screen in the room. Another small shift moved through the executives, subtle but collective, a shared understanding that something significant had just been avoided, not by the system, not by the process, but by someone they had not even considered part of it. Richard's gaze did not leave Elijah as he continued, quieter now, more precise. You did not have to say anything. It was not a question. It was a statement that carried something beneath it, something that had not been present before. Elijah met his gaze without hesitation, his posture still calm, unchanged, the same steadiness that had been there from the beginning. No, he said simply. The answer was not defensive. It was not proud. It was honest. That was what made it land. Richard nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if accepting something that extended beyond the numbers in front of him. He glanced briefly at the table, at the executives who had already shifted in their seats, their earlier certainty replaced with a more measured attention, then back to Elijah. Stay, he said. The word was quiet, but it carried across the room with clarity, not as a command, but as an invitation that did not need emphasis. For a moment, no one spoke. No one moved. The weight of that single word settled differently than anything that had come before it, because it did not restore the old structure, it altered it. Elijah did not respond immediately. His eyes moved briefly, not around the room, not searching for reaction, but inward, as if measuring the distance between where he stood and where he was being asked to remain. Then he gave a small nod, barely visible, but enough. Richard turned slightly, shifting his focus back to the table, but the alignment had changed, the roles no longer defined by titles alone, but by something proven in the space between them. "We rebuild the model from this point," Richard said, his voice steady again, but grounded in something different now. No assumptions that cannot hold under pressure. No projections that rely on appearance over structure. The executives nodded, not out of habit, but out of agreement, their attention sharper, more focused, as if the standard had just been raised without announcement. The room moved again, but differently this time, not with confidence alone, but with awareness, each action measured against a truth that had already been tested. And at the edge of it all, Elijah remained, no longer invisible, not yet defined, but undeniably present, the silence around him no longer empty, but filled with something that had finally been recognized, even if no one had the words for it yet. The room did not return to what it had been, not even as the meeting resumed, not even as voices found their rhythm again and screens filled with updated projections, because something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone by simply continuing forward. The light outside had softened into early evening, the skyline now painted in muted gold and shadow, the reflection stretching across the glass walls and settling quietly over the table where decisions were being rebuilt, not repeated. Elijah stood near the edge of the room, no longer holding the mop, no longer defined by the cart that now rested silently against the wall, his presence no longer something to overlook, but something that had already altered the direction of everything in motion. No one asked him to leave. No one questioned why he remained. The absence of those reactions said more than any acknowledgment could. Richard Hale moved back toward his chair slowly, his steps measured, not out of hesitation, but consideration, the kind that followed when authority was no longer assumed to be enough on its own. He paused for a brief moment before sitting, his hand resting lightly on the top of the chair, fingers tracing the edge as if recognizing something about it that had not been fully understood before. Then he sat, the movement controlled, deliberate, but different now, not occupying the seat, but settling into it with awareness. His eyes lifted once more, not scanning the room, but landing briefly on Elijah, holding there for a second longer than necessary, an unspoken acknowledgment passing between them, not loud, not performative, but real. The meeting continued, but the structure had changed. Questions were asked differently. Assumptions were challenged before they were accepted. Silence was no longer something to fill quickly, but something to listen to, because it had already proven to hold more than noise ever could. Time moved forward, steady and uninterrupted, yet the weight of the moment lingered beneath every decision, shaping it, grounding it, ensuring that what had been overlooked once would not be overlooked again. When the final documents were adjusted and the new model confirmed, the room began to clear, chairs sliding back, devices closing, conversations returning in quieter tones, more measured, more aware. One by one, the executives stepped out, their movements no longer rushed, each carrying with them the subtle understanding that something had changed, not just in the deal, but in the way they would approach the next one. Elijah remained where he was, watching none of it directly, his gaze resting instead on the reflection in the glass, the same layered image of the city, the room, and himself standing between them, no longer separate, no longer divided by the role he had been given. Richard was the last to move. He stood slowly from the chair, straightening his jacket with a small, habitual motion, then stepped around the table, closing the distance once more, not out of necessity, but intention. He stopped beside Elijah, not in front of him, not above him, but beside him, both of them facing the window, the city stretching out below in steady motion. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence returned, but it was not the same as before. It did not carry tension. It carried clarity. Richard exhaled quietly, the sound almost lost in the space around them, then spoke, his voice low, controlled, but without distance. "You saw something we did not." It was not an apology. It was not a justification. It was the truth, stated simply, without protection. Elijah did not turn. His eyes remained on the reflection, on the alignment that had finally settled into place. "It was always there," he said, just as quietly. The words did not accuse. They did not elevate. They existed as fact. Richard nodded.